There's a scene in Avengers Endgame that's become uncomfortably relevant in the last few months. Right after the 5-year time jump, Captain America dips out of his group therapy session to go visit Black Widow at the Avengers compound, and mentions that on the drive over he saw whales swimming in the Hudson. In the age of COVID-19, one of the few silver linings has been the supposed positive effects sheltering in place has had on the environment. Amidst the constant bad news, we've been told we should keep our chins up, because at least Mom is doing well. Emissions are down, there's cute wino elephants in China, and, just like in the Avengers, dolphins swimming in the Venetian Canal. I mean, it's no whales in the Hudson, but come on, reality is to Disney what Pepsi is to Coke. There's just one problem. None of that good news is strictly true. The elephants and the dolphins are old footage and pictures reposted with misleading titles, and while emissions are down, those reductions are from temporary decreases in transportation, whereas powering houses still burns a ton of resources. And with businesses reopening, emissions from transportation are bound to increase again. These fluff pieces are a way to contextualize our current suffering as something meaningful, but they also frame climate change as an inevitable result of human nature, a result that's being halted through a drastic reduction in our population, followed by a retreat into our private living spaces. This is Eco-Fascism, an ideology that's as terrifying as it sounds, and which forms the philosophical basis for the highest-grossing film of all time. Eco-Fascism is a strand of fascism concerned with the cultivation and preservation of nature. Famously, Nazi Germany enacted several pieces of environmental protection and animal rights legislation, but the reasons for doing so were different than the reasons people push for green policies today. These policies were rooted in a phrase you may have heard. Blood and soil! Blood and soil! As Michael Zimmerman notes in his essay Eco-Fascism, An Enduring Temptation, fascists typically distinguish between different races or stocks of people, some of who are ostensibly superior to others. According to the Nazis, Aryans were superior to all races, and their Aryan blood was mystically linked to the German soil. Arthur Schoenstein, a Nazi environmentalist, which those sure are 2 words, said that the Third Reich was rooted in the primordial forces of life and soul that are proper to the German race, and from the nature-willed bond that subsists between them and the sod of the homeland. The environmental policies were an offshoot of the desire to preserve this connection, as was the need to expel supposedly foreign forces like communism and capitalism that believe nature has no inherent value, but instead is merely raw material to be transformed by labor into human goods. Rather than mere environmental policy, eco-fascism was a means of turning Germany into a sacred space in which the German people belonged, as opposed to a section of land penned in by politically constructed borders. Environmental protections were enacted because the German character derived from the land, and to destroy the land was to destroy the German character. Flipping the coin over, the Nazis could use this view of nature to code anyone they claimed was un-German as foreign, and therefore worthy of expulsion from Germany because their mere physical presence supposedly degraded the German character, and by extension the land itself. This perverted environmentalism evolved out of the concept of Lebensraum and eugenics and helped to justify the murder of millions of Jews, socialists, queer people, Slavs, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, disabled people, and Freemasons. As eco-fascism has evolved, it's lost a lot of the atavism, especially in the Americas, where any fascist claim to being the ancient inhabitants of the land is undercut somewhat by the presence of indigenous peoples, the actual ancient inhabitants of the land. In America, the environmentalist movement began hand in hand with eco-fascist ideology. Writing for The Guardian, Jeff Sparrow notes that early conservation movements and national parks were set up by Teddy Roosevelt, amongst others, in part to protect animals hunted by impoverished immigrants trying to put food on the table. Teddy hunted for sport, you see, and it's more sporting by far to feed prime bear steak to the dogs while leftovers rot in front of your starving constituents. Using every part of the buffalo. Trees goach. Roosevelt also held genocidal views of indigenous peoples. He once said that I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indian is the dead Indian, but I believe 9 out of every 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th. The most vicious cowboy has more moral principle than the average Indian. They are reckless, revengeful, and fiendishly cruel. He also defended the Sandy Creek Massacre, in which over 100 people from the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes were murdered and mutilated. In his book The Winning of the West, Roosevelt wrote that all men of sane and wholesome thought must dismiss with impatient contempt the plea that these continents should be reserved for the use of scattered savage tribes.
The fact that ensuring white people would have use of the continent's resources would require removing indigenous people from their land, either through mass murder or assimilation, was of no consequence to Roosevelt. He felt that the most ultimately righteous of all wars is a war with savages, American and Indian, Boer and Zulu, Cossack and Tartar, New Zealander and Maori. In each case, the victor, horrible though many of his deeds are, has laid deep the foundations for the future greatness of a mighty people. The westward expansion of the United States justified any and all bloodshed. Roosevelt's views were the norm amongst American conservationists. There were two goals of conservation. First, to ensure that America's natural resources were not exhausted through reckless overuse, and second, to ensure that ecosystems that might be destroyed in the process of industrialization and colonization would be preserved as public land, so people could see the country the way it was when it was uninhabited. There's just one problem with that. The land was never uninhabited. Author Mark David Spence notes that as Native American populations were murdered under the cover of Manifest Destiny, the idea of wilderness was twisted to mean a place before people, an idealized natural landscape that ignored the actual history of these magnificent places. The rush to preserve pristine pieces of the West simultaneously wrote its history, framing it as mostly empty land there for the taking, as opposed to a home for hundreds of varied cultures and societies. Conservationists praised the beauty of the West, which was supposedly formed by nature working unchecked. In reality, that beauty had been shaped by centuries of native inhabitants who utilized controlled burning, horticulture, and other techniques to manage the ecosystems they depended on. Preserving these spaces as national parks involved seizing the land from the indigenous people who lived on it. As Spence says, uninhabited wilderness had to be created before it could be preserved. Conservation offered yet another excuse to seize land from indigenous peoples, but it also helped to launder the violence of colonialism. It changed the perception from committing genocide against hundreds of different societies and seizing their land into moving to some wilderness and having a couple gunfights with some random folks who happened to pass through from time to time. Some didn't even make a distinction between the ecosystems they were preserving and the people who lived there. An early conservationist and painter named George Catlin proposed that national parks would be like zoos where the world could see for ages to come the native Indian in his classic attire, galloping his wild horse with sinewy bow and shield and lance amid the fleeting herds of elk and buffalo. He talked about preserving indigenous people's way of life the same way most people talk about game reserves. It's a horrifically dehumanizing view, and it's one the Nazis later drew inspiration from. In a 1928 speech, Hitler praised the American approach to colonization, and the way Americans had gunned down the millions of to a few 100,000, and now keep the modest remnant under observation in a cage.
Many conservationists extended their ambitions into anti-immigrant hate speak, comparing immigrants to an invasive species that threatens the health of native flora and fauna. They claim that immigrants polluted America's racial stock. Conservation movements read the hierarchies of the animal kingdom onto human society, positioning white people as the apex species and attempting to bar immigrants from America in order to maintain that superiority. America's conservation movements predated and in fact inspired the Nazis. For instance, a conservationist named Madison Grant wrote a book about white supremacy that Hitler literally referred to as his Bible. Both strands of right-wing environmentalism wove a reverent, romantic love of nature into the core of their ideologies, which helped to legitimize systemic racism via claims that it was natural. Post-war, however, right-wing environmentalism shifted from being an integrated part of fascist policy into a racist dog whistle with no actual environmental consideration attached. As Sparrow notes, in 1968, Paul Ehrlich published a book called The Population Bomb, in which he argued that ecological destruction, and indeed almost all societal problems, could be attributed to overpopulation. The book launched a strain of environmental thought known as population theory, which argued that the key to halting environmental collapse was halting population growth. Population theory has been widely discredited, though, due to the fact that a mere 20 fossil fuel companies can be linked to more than 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions in the modern era. The problem is not that there's too many people and too little to go around, it's that capitalism allows corporations to use exorbitant amounts of resources without any thought towards sustainability. Alas, when has something not being true ever stopped a conservative? Framing the planet's resources as inadequate to meet the needs of humanity is useful for the right because it takes the responsibility for responding to the crisis away by saying, "Ah shucks, there's just too many of us. What are you gonna do?" Population theory is even more useful to full-blown fascists because it brooks questions about who gets the limited resources and why. For our purposes, we'll focus on white supremacist Garrett Hardin's lifeboat thought experiment. Hardin encourages people to think of the world's resources as a lifeboat with a capacity of 10, surrounded by hundreds of drowning people. He argues that the only ethical thing to do is bar anyone else from entering the boat because the extra weight would sink it. It's basically the last 20 minutes of Titanic, Jim Cameron's other eco-conscious masterwork. As far as eco-cinema, it goes Ferngully, Avatar, Titanic, Princess Mononoke. Oh, look who's in the lifeboats. An equal distribution of people from every class and race across every section of the ship. Eco-fascists subvert the anxiety of climate change into anti-immigrant, genocidal rhetoric that advocates for closing borders to climate refugees and hoarding resources. This won't prevent climate genocide, of course, but eco-fascists view those deaths as necessary because the white people who ride out the storm in their racist arc will get to live utopic lives free of resource competition. It's an attempt to push the conversation around climate change towards adopting policies already espoused by white nationalists attempting to defend our way of life from immigrants. So, anyways, thank you for being patient. We've now arrived at the part where America's ass hits Grimace with a metaphor. Thanos is an eco-fascist who subscribes to the lifeboat model of resource distribution. He explains his motivations for this to Gamora about halfway through Infinity War.
This universe is finite, its resources finite. If life is left unchecked, life will cease to exist.
He says this like it's a law of nature on par with, like, entropy or thermodynamics or the other one. Thanos' solution to the problem of ecological collapse is genocide, to kill half of all life, but it's totally random and impartial, so he's not racist, like in a real genocide. We swear. Obviously, I'm not breaking any new ground here by calling him a fascist, but I think it's important to look at the way the narrative both demonizes Thanos and sympathizes with him, as well as the reasoning behind those choices. While the Avengers films don't give us a line-by-line reading of the constitution of Thanos' galactic paramilitary empire, they do depict Thanos and his lackeys wielding and justifying power and violence in a very fascistic manner. Writing in the Doctrine of Fascism, Benito Mussolini, or more likely his ghostwriter, states that fascism denies that the majority, through the mere fact of being a majority, can rule human societies. It affirms the irremediable, fruitful, and beneficent inequality of men, who cannot be leveled by such a mechanical and extrinsic fact as universal suffrage. Benito, just because you use big words doesn't make it true. People are inherently unequal. Therefore, only the powerful have the right to rule. Thanos echoes this idea in the first scene of Infinity War, when he tells a defeated Thor that he knows how it feels to be certain that you're right and still lose. For Thanos, the most important thing about a policy or a belief is the power to actually enforce it. It doesn't matter what the Asgardians want if they can't defend themselves. Part of what's interesting about Thanos is that he never tries to get his victims to sympathize with him. Sure, he explains the reasoning behind his actions, but in most stories where a villain justifies violence by claiming it's in the interest of the greater good, the villain takes pains to make clear that their cruelty is reluctant. This isn't the case with Thanos. There are multiple scenes in the Avengers films where Thanos revels in his own power like he's fucking Skeletor. There's the aforementioned bit where Thanos taunts Thor, the constant repetition of his 8th most annoying catchphrase,
I am.
Or when he plays that mind game with Star-Lord and Gamora, forcing Peter to murder her only to turn the bullets into bubbles for, like, comedic effect. That last scene ends with him saying,
Reality is often disappointing. Now, reality can be whatever I want.
In case it wasn't obvious that Thanos enjoys power partially because it's gratifying for his own ego. In the first scene of Infinity War, we get a philosophical framing for Thanos' love of power when he gets the second Infinity Stone. Thanos' wizard dude, the Ebony Maw of the Black Order. See, it's subtle, but he's called that because he's evil. Not sure if you picked up on that. So anyways, that dude says that Thanos is the only living being with...
has ever had the might, nay the nobility, to wield not one, but 2 Infinity Stones.
Infinity Stones don't require nobility to use, though. Just the right physiology. Unless Disney's really trying to tell me that the worst Chris is noble.
Fucking hilarious.
That's not something that props can fix. Sorry. I'm out!
Thanos has the physical capability to use an Infinity Stone and is willing to do so, and that is conflated with nobility. The Black Order is constructed around this fact. Its only purpose is to enable Thanos' quest to collect and use the Infinity Stones, with him at the head due in part to his physical capabilities. Physiological characteristics used to frame a person as morally upright and deserving of high social status. Where have I heard of that before? All other considerations of the non-Thanos members of the Black Order are moot, to the point that the lowliest foot soldier will bash their brains out on a wall to get Thanos what he wants. The entire political apparatus is an extension of his will. Mussolini said that the fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. Thus understood, fascism is totalitarian, and the fascist state, a synthesis and a unit inclusive of all values, interprets, develops, and potentiates the whole life of a people. Fascism is collectivist, seeking to make the state the sole source of meaning in every citizen's life. When Mussolini says that the state is inclusive of all values, he doesn't mean multicultural coexistence. He means that all values must be incorporated into the state and either approved by it or destroyed. State values are the only values. Again, we see signs of this in the film. Thanos' followers, his victims, and his victim followers are all given the moniker Children of Thanos.
Smile, for even in death, you have become children of Thanos.
This scene is framed like a religious conversion, which is odd because the Asgardians aren't converting to a new belief. They are being murdered very much against their wishes. The moniker symbolically draws Thanos' victims under the same umbrella as his followers without their consent. Whether or not those massacred believe in his quest or personally feel that it potentiates their life is of no consequence, because their deaths, willing or no, still serve the state's ends. Their lives had purpose because their deaths were useful. This is why Thanos loves power. Back on Titan, when he proposed his solution to climate change and everyone put it to a vote, the verdict was that he was crazy. Power flattens those considerations under a boot, though, allowing him to save everybody whether they like it or not. Fascism denies the majority the right to rule itself, and Thanos denies the majority the right to decide how they tackle climate change. We can't be trusted with that decision. He alone can, because he's a visionary who tells it like it is. Fascism is often referred to as a political religion for the way it centralizes the state as the only source of existential meaning, makes use of iconography and ceremonies, and props up a leading individual as the personification of the political religion's mission. For an example of this religiosity, think of the mystical way the Nazis viewed their land, or the fact that Mussolini was almost excommunicated for pagan worship of the state, or just everything to do with Savitra Devi, but we don't have time for that right now. As previously mentioned, the Black Order treats Thanos with religious reverence, but he takes it a step further in literally trying to become God. Thanos' goal is to look out over a grateful universe. It isn't enough that he paternalistically murders everyone for their own good. Thanos wants to be loved for it. He wants to be worshipped. Thanos thinks his ideology is so self-evident that once he's killed half of everyone, the remaining half will all see that he was right and thank him. In Endgame, when he realizes this isn't the case, Thanos decides to wipe out all life in the entire universe and remake it in his own image. It isn't enough that he has the power to exterminate people at will. Those that survive need to love their own subjugation.
Dying or being spared makes you a child of Thanos, and you have to be grateful for that because being violently robbed of self-determination has somehow made your life better. Now, all of this is obviously horrible, unless you're Disney, in which case it's an effective means of fighting climate change that's just a scooch too violent to be put in practice by moral people. The thing about Thanos is that even though he's a fucking monster, the movies really want you to sympathize with him. Across Infinity War, one of the themes developed is the will to sacrifice for the greater good, and a dichotomy is established between Thanos and the Avengers along that line. Infinity War attempts to create sympathy for Thanos by showing us how much it hurts him to pursue his mission, and the film does this by zeroing in on the relationship dynamic between him and Gamora. While there are several early descriptions of Thanos' particular method of environmental activism in Infinity War, all given by other characters, the first time we get an explanation from the man himself is when he gives one to Gamora. Notice the way Thanos is framed in this scene. He offers her soup and sits on the stairs instead of the throne because Gamora says she hates the throne. He doesn't raise his voice or threaten her. He explains himself calmly and has a perfect explanation lined up for all of her complaints. Murdering Gamora's parents and kidnapping her wasn't wrong because she lived in squalor and he wanted to save her. Massacring her people wasn't wrong because their planet was on the verge of collapse and it was the only way to avert that. Abusing Gamora wasn't wrong because it made her strong. Thanos is emotionally manipulative. He gaslights Gamora into believing that he imposed all of that trauma on her out of love. Maybe he was hard on her, but it was for her own good. At first, the scene's execution does nothing to undercut Thanos' manipulations. The camera work emphasizes how much physical distance Thanos has placed between himself and Gamora, as well as the fact that he has lowered himself down to her level by sitting on the stairs. He poses no physical threat. Josh Brolin's line delivery is calm and weary. He presents himself as a father disappointed by the fact that his daughter can't see his perspective, doesn't value the sacrifices he made for her, and has chosen a different path in life than the one he envisioned she would. We can feel his pain at their estrangement, which is ridiculous because that estrangement is the result of his being a murderous bastard. Then, as Thanos says that he's the only one with the will to do what is necessary, the scene shifts. He stands up and crosses over to Gamora. The camera takes a high angle, emphasizing how he towers over her, how she can no longer meet his gaze. The physical threat has returned. We transition to a scene where he tortures Nebula to force Gamora to tell him where the Soul Stone is. The scene shows that, even though he believes he genuinely loves his daughter and cares for the fate of the universe, Thanos is comfortable directing violence at anyone, even the people he loves. This could have been the start of an interesting arc where the film gradually punctures his self-important ramblings to reveal that Thanos uses love as a justification for violent control. His arc could reveal how shallow and perverted that kind of love is, putting the lie to the idea that an abusive fascist like Thanos could ever care about anything except power. I say could because the film actually proceeds to ratify everything Thanos says. Pretty much every scene between Gamora and Thanos is her calling him out for being a piece of shit, and him calmly responding with some logical reason for why being a piece of shit is good, actually. This dynamic builds to a climax in the scene where Thanos is told that to get the Soul Stone, he'll have to sacrifice the thing he loves the most. This is essentially the universe, via the Soul Stone, judging whether Thanos truly loves anything. The scene is infuriating. Gamora is right about everything she says here, but then the movie decides that she isn't. Thanos framing genocide as mercy is absurd, and Thanos saying he loves Gamora is a lie, because if you love somebody, you don't abuse them. Abuse isn't tough love. It doesn't make the person you abuse stronger, and it isn't in their best interest. Abuse is just abuse. And then the universe goes, fucking A, mate, healthy relationship right there, dad of the year, here's your rock. My issue isn't that Thanos subjectively thinks he loves Gamora, or that he's saving everybody. My issue is that the Soul Stone looks at his relationship with Gamora and calls it genuine love, even though she despises him. It's a shitty act of manipulation. The film forces us to view Thanos as a loving father who gives up his child to save us all, as opposed to the thing he actually is, an abuser. At the end of the film, when Thanos says that doing what was necessary cost him everything, the tragedy presented isn't that a deluded man with a god complex murdered his child to enable further pointless violence. The tragedy is how high the cost of building a better world was. It's a common observation that fascists expand the gender dynamics of patriarchy and the means by which they disenfranchise women and queer people, using them as a basis for authoritarianism. Philosopher Umberto Eco laid out 14 common features of fascism which he had identified, number 12 being machismo and weaponry. Machismo implies both disdain for women and intolerance and condemnation of non-standard sexual habits, from chastity to homosexuality. Echo was highlighting the way fascists use the toxic and rigid definitions of gender and sexuality native to the patriarchy in order to make men feel insecure in their masculinity, thus easier to go to violence and hatred in order to prove how manly they are. In her essay 3 Guineas, Virginia Woolf responds to H.G. Wells' claim that feminists had done nothing to oppose the rise of fascism by arguing, the daughters of educated men who were called, to their resentment, feminists, were in fact the advance guard of your own movement. They were fighting the same enemy that you are fighting, and for the same reasons. They were fighting the tyranny of the patriarchal state as you are fighting the tyranny of the fascist state. The means by which women were disenfranchised in Britain at the time are the same means by which fascists initially restricted the freedom of undesirables, denying the right to vote or hold property and restricting employment. The psychology of the patriarchy is a building block in the psychology of fascism. There is a line from the patriarchal violence Thanos levels at his children and the violence he levels at the galaxy. As I mentioned earlier, Thanos calls everyone he conquers children of Thanos, which means he models his relationship to all the people he snaps out of existence off of his relationship with Gamora and his other children. He literally thinks of the state in the same terms as his patriarchal family. The way he loves Gamora is the same way he loves everyone else. By having the Soul Stone judge his love for Gamora and declare it to be pure, the film essentially hand-waves any questions about Thanos' motives. This can't all be a shamefaced attempt to play God, because Thanos loves Gamora, and by extension loves everybody else. Thanos hurts because he cares, and it hurts him to hurt us. He attacked to protect. The film isn't just presenting how he justifies his actions to himself. An impartial third party, the most impartial third party, finds no contradictions in Thanos' feelings which might invalidate them. The closest thing the MCU has to God signs off on the idea that you can express love through abuse and murder. Easily the most iconic scene in the two films is the snap, and yet the material fallout of the snap is pretty much ignored. The entire first act of Endgame is rooted in all of our movie friends working through their grief, but we never hear if the snap actually ended climate change. Like, there are things happening, for sure, and the things that are happening here are happening everywhere, and we know that the things are bad because the other places don't have Avengers to deal with them, and the Avengers only do, like, certified bad vibes and not bar mitzvahs or office retreats. Now, we have no idea what those things are, but the Yakuza are still here, so Sega's doing great. The only environmental impact of the snap we are told about is the aforementioned whales in the Hudson, which implies that it worked. Beyond being a bit emptier and metsless, the Earth doesn't seem to have changed all that much. Hulk gives TED Talks now, Instagram is still a thing, and the upper middle class, by which I mean middle upper class, still hit up ritzy restaurants in Manhattan. Oh, and Gamora's home planet is a paradise now, so I guess genocide is a certified climate change solution. The only cost of killing half the people seems to be that the other half are really sad about it, but otherwise it worked as intended. Nature's doing just fine. To orchestrate Thanos' downfall, the filmmakers turn not to questioning his clearly inconsistent motivations or tearing open the mile-wide holes in the logic of his plan, more on that later, but to magical thinking. Thanos' motives are pure and his plan works. That isn't the problem is that he has a total failure of moral imagination. Thanos is willing to take any immoral action to avoid the worst possible scenario. He calls that morality, while the Avengers take the exact opposite course, as summed up by Captain America's credo.
We don't trade lives.
In Infinity War, the Avengers refuse to sacrifice even one life to save trillions, choosing to perform a time-consuming surgery to remove the Reality Stone from Vision's head rather than kill him in the process of destroying it. This choice leads directly to Thanos getting the stone and, killing everybody. The Avengers believe that if they abide by the most rigid moral principle possible, everything will turn out okay, even when that moral principle is in direct conflict with their goal of not getting genocided. The thing is, they're not wrong. Whenever the Avengers do try to trade lives, it fails horribly. Star-Lord shoots Gamora and it doesn't work. Then Scarlet Witch kills Vision by breaking the yellow Infinity Stone, only for Thanos to fly backwards around the Earth really fast so he can rip that sucker right out of Vision's head himself. Wait, that's the wrong movie. My point is that when push comes to shove, the Avengers all make the same calculation Thanos does and get the same answer. If we don't strategically murder some folks real quick, everybody's gonna die. Unlike Thanos, though, when the Avengers do it, it doesn't work. The film Deus Ex Machina's their friend back to life, and whatever horrific outcome whichever Avenger was willing to kill to stop happens anyways. When Doctor Strange gives up the Time Stone to save Tony's life, it's a rejection of trading lives, and it's the move that saves everybody in Endgame. The film takes pains to show how counterintuitive the move is via the odds Strange lists. There is no way this should work. Strange's actions cause half the universe to die after all, and yet it does. Thanos' approach to the problem of climate change is a cynical and desperate response to an inevitability. The Avengers, however, respond by asking if the inevitable is really inevitable, because if it isn't, then sacrificing innocent lives to escape it is unjustifiable. You cannot live believing the worst-case scenario is the only one possible. The fear of that will poison you. The Avengers win by refusing to give in to that fear, by holding fast to their principles and valuing individual lives even in the face of overwhelming evidence that doing so is suicidal. They don't beat Thanos by outsmarting him or outfighting him, they win by outhoping him. While Iron Man and Black Widow do wind up sacrificing themselves, it's their choice, not somebody else's callous arithmetic trolley probleming them into oblivion. They have the agency. It's proof that Thanos is wrong when he says regular people can't make the sacrifices he will. It's also a real sacrifice because, shocker, murdering a bunch of people and demanding to be loved for it is actually really selfish. Instead, they give up their lives for their friends. The Avengers win because they won't go back on their principles. Opposing fascism on the moral grounds that, no matter the benefits, it isn't worth the horrific costs in human life is fine and dandy, but I think the filmmakers are missing out by not opposing it for both moral reasons and the fact that fascism is fucking stupid. One of the things that makes Thanos so insufferable is that his plan makes no sense. How is resource scarcity a problem in the MCU? Every single culture, other than Earth apparently, has faster than light travel. Space is infinite, and full of an infinite amount of unpopulated planets. If you can travel between planets, then there's no way you should ever run out of resources. I mean, it sucks that your home planet might become uninhabitable due to an unsustainable society, but no one's gonna die. In the real world, we've only got the one planet, and that's the problem. Why do you think Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos keep trying to convince everybody that colonizing space is viable? It's because their power comes from capitalism. They're afraid we'll realize that our current system is untenable and killing the planet. They're afraid that we'll eat them, so they're trying to come up with a magic bullet that can solve the problem without radically changing things. Even if we concede the resource scarcity thing, which I'm not willing to do, but whatever, there's the fact that Thanos gains control over reality, and the best thing he can think to do with it is kill a bunch of people. Just make more resources. I'm not going to dwell on this, because literally every person who watched the movie had the exact same thought, but it's stupid. You have the power of a god. You can remold the universe in your own image, and genocide is the best you can come up with. Thanos really never considers changing the rules of reality. There are so many better options. On top of that, people procreate. We make more of us. It's kind of our thing. In a few hundred years, the galaxy is going to be in the exact same boat all over again. The snap is not a permanent solution. Also, did we all just forget the time Tony Stark solved the sustainable energy problem? He invented a self-sustaining, portable source of clean energy.
In a cave! With a box of scraps!
And the best thing he could think to do with it was power a bunch of tiny-ass Gundams that he then used to kill some random insurgents in order to try and forge peace in the Middle East. If you want peace in the Middle East, it seems to me like putting the fossil fuel industry out of commission would be a better start, but you do you, dude. I don't want to go full cinema sins on the MCU, but I feel the need to point out that in fiction none of this makes any sense. Partially I think that's because Eco-Fascism also makes no sense in real life. It's a movement that tries to prop up the untenable through violence. There's two strands of Eco-Fascism I see get thrown around a lot, starting with the bad tweets I mentioned at the top, the "we're the virus and COVID is the vaccine" takes, if you will. If you look at a cumulative graph of emissions over time since the Industrial Revolution, you might notice something. Comparing the USA's emissions to anyone else, let alone a less industrialized nation in the global south, is laughable in like a not very funny way. On top of that, within the US, the carbon footprint of a billionaire who owns a private jet or sits on the board of an oil company is going to be so much higher than a minimum wage worker struggling to pay rent. Again, 100 companies are responsible for 70% of emissions. COVID doesn't really kill billionaires. It mostly kills poor people working essential service jobs, poor people who are often black, indigenous, or people of color. Saying we're the virus ignores the fact that we are not all equally to blame for climate crisis. In fact, it's mostly some very specific corporations, bolstered by various Western nations' inability or refusal to curtail them, who are to blame for the climate crisis. These takes are essentially cheering for the deaths of thousands of people who didn't cause the problem, even as the people who did cause the problem make the virus and the climate crisis worse by forcing the economy back into gear before it's safe to do so. COVID's brief run of putting the brakes on the economy is already over because some Republicans and Democrats and billionaire jagoffs have decided, fuck it, killing thousands of people is just gonna have to be the cost of continuing to kill the planet. The second strand are the Thanoses. As the climate crisis worsens, huge portions of the global south and the global north and the planet will grow uninhabitable. The flow of climate refugees will be added to pre-existing refugee crises. There are already migrants fleeing violence in South and Central America, violence caused by America's policy of undermining leftist governments via supporting fascist coups. There are also more refugees fleeing the horrors of the Syrian civil war and Saudi Arabia's invasion of Yemen, and many more conflicts caused in part by decades of American imperialism. In 2019, the UN estimated that there were close to 80 million displaced peoples around the world, and none of those problems will get better with the addition of food and resource scarcity or increasingly common natural disasters. Eco-fascists don't see a problem with any of this. Sparrow quotes the El Paso mass shooters manifesto, which says, if we can get rid of enough people, then our way of life can become more sustainable. The shooter murdered Latinos for myriad reasons, but one was the idea that refugees fleeing South America would strain the USA's resources. He cited the Christchurch shooter, who murdered Muslims out of similar paranoia. Eco-fascists don't want to change the system causing all this death. They don't want to uproot the white supremacy which helps justify putting pipelines through reserves against the express wishes of indigenous peoples. They don't want to end the paranoid fear of the left which has created so much suffering in South America. They don't want to end the imperialist buccaneering serving only as a means to give the military-industrial complex something to point all its guns at. They don't want to change a system that perpetuates these things because they view them as good. Instead, eco-fascists suggest hoarding as much as we can get and closing the borders on the refugees fleeing the shitstorms we created in order to ensure there's enough to go around amongst our, meaning white, people. It's an ideology that is both profoundly cruel and naive. The economic system that burnt through most of the world's resource isn't going to get more sustainable because you force it into tighter confines. Pretending the West can just turn itself into an island ignores the fact that we offloaded most of our industrial base onto countries with laxer labor laws and fewer unions back in the 80s. Climate change will cause natural disasters and famines across the entire world, which will force huge portions of these countries' populations to flee in order to escape starvation, which will lead to a breakdown in the entire global supply chain. And that's before you even consider the fact that the same droughts and disasters that destroy their agricultural capacity will destroy our own. So much of what is ours comes from somewhere else, and if we do nothing to stop their collapse, we will collapse too. Modern eco-fascists use overpopulation in the same way the Nazis used romanticism and the way xenophobic conservationists used a false equivalency from invasive species in the food chain to diplomatic and racial relations. The ideas are bullshit, but they lend racism a naturalistic appeal. Framing the climate crisis as the result of population growth makes it all of our faults for simply existing. That mindset allows privileged people, who can hope to be spared at least the initial horrors of the crisis, to look forward to it with apathy, or even self-righteous glee. It's schadenfreude at a global level. The population bomb is useful rhetorically because it makes fascist policies seem like the natural response to climate crisis. There is, after all, only one way to end overpopulation in a short time frame. There's a perverse hope to eco-fascism. Amidst the roiling storm of daily life under late capitalism, it's tempting to dream of some world-shaking event to come along and wipe all the pieces off the board. Rather than a systemic failure, fascists point the finger at the generic masses, who all just happen to be people of color. Basically, fascists use the pastoral fantasy of the post-apocalypse to breed a nihilistic acceptance of what's coming. They hope to use the turmoil of the climate crisis to seize power. Whether they're consciously manipulating people or they genuinely believe it is immaterial, because the death of humanity is not a reasonable price to pay for Karens to get back into gardening. Ecological collapse isn't a reset button, it's scorched earth. The fact that this is a conversation we're having at all is absurd, because the climate crisis isn't inevitable. It's inevitable under industrial capitalism. Under capitalism, the only value land has is its ability to create profit, and to create that profit, capitalism has steamrolled this planet and its organisms, gouging out mountains, overexploiting fish stocks, and burning fossil fuels to power the maniacal pursuit of growth and enrich a fraction of humanity. It's no wonder that we're in this boat. The thing is, there are other options. There are indigenous spiritual traditions across the world which view the land as sacred, something which cannot be owned and must be respected. They are on the ground doing the work of blocking pipelines and protecting forests and the biodiversity of their own lands. We have no-growth economic models which seek to cap profits and descale the economy rather than constantly increasing production by seeking new markets and extracting more resources. If you want to get real spicy, there's eco-socialists who seek to nationalize banking interests and redistribute in order to fund environmental initiatives. I'm not here to solve the climate crisis because I'm not qualified to do that. But my point is, we just need to imagine a world where we see ourselves as integrated into nature and view it as having intrinsic value that must be protected, rather than viewing it as a thing to be exploited for profit or as a mystical excuse for murder. We need to take action to make that world a reality. Like right now. Anything less is monstrous. You might think you'll be behind the wall when it goes down, and congrats on being a piece of shit, by the way, but you won't. Climate genocide isn't just going to kill most people, it's going to kill everyone. It isn't hard to see why Disney would present eco-fascism so uncritically, but in doing so they're playing with fire. As a massive media conglomerate, Disney profits from the same systems that allow these oil conglomerates to kill the planet. Degrowth or full-on revolution would hurt their bottom line. Capitalists are not going to create art that advocates for ending capitalism. Thanos can't be a socialist or an anarchist, because then he would be placing the blame for climate change squarely on capitalism. Well, he could, but then his ideological motivations would have to be unsympathetic lest the audience get any ideas. And then you're dunking on leftists in a way that'll feel out of touch with the 15 to 30 demographic that watches the movies. So instead, he's an eco-fascist, and climate change can be the inevitable result of human population multiplying. More importantly, it can be nobody's fault. The problem is they then have to frame his solution, genocide, as being effective, because if it isn't effective, that means Thanos was wrong, and we're back to asking why the climate is changing. Rather than question the validity of eco-fascism, Disney turns to opposing it on moral grounds. The cure can't be worse than the disease, essentially. It's a neat trick, because in framing this as the only effective climate change solution, they can easily say that the only moral thing to do about the crisis is nothing. Within the MCU, climate change doesn't matter. No one cared about it before Infinity War, and in Spider-Man Far From Home, the biggest change to the universe is that Tony's dead. No one mentions climate change. There's no shitheads and Thanos did nothing wrong t-shirts or debates about a better way to deal with the crisis. Thanos was the crisis, not climate change. Now he's gone, so that's it. There's no need to deal with the underlying problems that could create a Thanos, because when push came to shove, everyone stood their ground and returned things to the status quo. Disney doesn't care about saving the planet. They care about making sure no one does anything drastic to save the planet. They're relying on the moral fortitude of the status quo to hold back fascism, which is a bad bet. In the MCU, the status quo worldview is so opposed to fascism that Thanos is literally going to have to restart the universe for his changes to stick. There's no sense of how the systems in place got us to this point. In real life, the status quo of Western imperialism, systemic racism, and unregulated capitalism and income inequality is causing climate change. Fascists use that to their benefit. The inherent cruelty and instability of the status quo will cause a crisis, and fascists hope to use that crisis to gain power. Upholding the status quo makes you more likely to fall to fascism when things get desperate, not less. The Avengers movies ask us to do nothing until the catastrophe is unavoidable, because the only way to stop it is worse than the catastrophe itself. It's a cynical lie dreamed up by millionaires playing chicken with the apocalypse. It's a lie that helps fascism far more than it hurts it, and it's a lie that makes the work of crawling back from the brink even harder than it already was. Don't fall for it.